perseverance is the intuitive part of grit. But what I mean by passion for long-term goals is that you are staying in love with something and in some abstract way, at least, going in the same direction for a long time. And when you think about people who have accomplished great things on this planet, I think it's just a necessity that you have to have some North Star, or you end up, basically running really hard in all different directions.
I'm Jack Newton, CEO of Clio, and this is the Daily Matters podcast. On Daily Matters, we talk with legal professionals, industry leaders, and subject matter experts about the future of law. We explore where the legal industry is headed, how legal practice is changing, and what you can be doing to position yourself for success. This episode of Daily Matters is brought to you by the 2020 Clio Cloud Conference, the world's best legal conference, featuring keynote speakers Seth Godin, Angela Duckworth, and Ben Crump. The conference will take place virtually from October 13th to 16th. Get your passes now before it's too late at cliocloudconference.com. Today's guest is Angela Duckworth, the founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance the science and practice of character development. Angela is also a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a 2013 MacArthur Fellow, and she's the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And her TED Talk is among the most viewed of all time. Angela will be a keynote speaker at the 2020 Clio Cloud Conference, which starts virtually on October 13th. Angela, it's a huge pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Jack. I'm excited for our conversation.
Me too. First of all, I'm a huge fan, so thrilled to have you at the conference and on the podcast here. We talk about your book and the concept of grit at Clio a lot. So it's truly an honor to be able to talk face to face with you about how you think about things, about grit in detail. I'd love to start our conversation off talking about your career path. You've had a very interesting, multifaceted, and in some ways unusual career path. And I'd love to hear some of the career highlights and what your experience along the way of your journey thus far has looked like.
Well, right now, as you know, I'm a professor and I get to see and talk to a lot of undergraduates. And every time I, talk to some angst-ridden 22-year-old, it's like, oh, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And, I'm a hard worker, but what am I going to work hard at? I'm sure you had that. I did, right? Like we all kind of go through that. And I think one thing that surprises the students that I talk to is when I say, look, for me, it took a decade. I hope it doesn't take you a decade, but I think for most people, it takes them more time than they would like to find something where you wake up in the morning and you're like, wow, I really do. I love what I do. And even at the point that I am at age 50, like it's part of who I am. But how did I get here? Being so excited about psychological science and how it can improve people's lives. I was, raised by Chinese immigrant parents in suburban Philadelphia, so on the New Jersey side. When I was in college, I was hearing, especially from my dad, that, like the thing to do was to go to medical school, like all of my cousins. Right. And, I think I'm one of the few, by the way, we do have a lawyer in the family. And so I gravitated to actually education. And I think it was because I really like kids a lot. And I think in the 10 years between graduating from college and actually graduating with all my pre-med requirements, by the way, and then, transitioning to enter a PhD program at the age of 32, and that PhD would be in psychology. I basically did a lot of sampling, and that is the term that many scientists use for this trial and error process where we, even outside of professions, pick up a sport, decide, sport's not for me. So I do think that grit, paradoxically, which I study, sustained passion and perseverance for long-term goals, requires a lot of sampling, which means quitting things.
And you've done some of that in your life. What did you find that you most connected with? Tell me about how your journey kind of helped you sample and maybe understand what you liked and what you attached to as the thing you would end up having that long-term perseverance in pursuing.
The first job, that full-time job that I sampled was running a summer school for middle school kids from the Cambridge area. So I started the school and I ran it. I was the oldest person at age 22 because the staff were all high school and college kids. So we were older kids teaching younger kids, and all of it being run by essentially a kid, right? A 22-year-old named Angela. I did that for a couple of years. I liked, and I think this is the right question to ask, like what gave me energy about it, and then what wasn't quite of it. I really liked the kids, and I loved the idea of working on the future, right? Education. Maybe what I didn't like about it, what didn't give me energy, was that it was, as anybody who has ever run anything, like just a lot of logistical difficulties. Right. Didn't love that. Then I went to Oxford. I got a master's in neuroscience. I loved about that, that, you know, I really do like understanding the brain and the human mind from a scientific standpoint. And then what I didn't love about that was that like, wait, how is this helping anyone? Where are all the kids? Like, how's this, you know, having impact? I went to McKinsey for a year. What I liked about that was like a lot of smart people thinking analytically, something I know you and listeners know a lot about. What I didn't like about that, again, was kids missing out in the picture. And then I actually spent a fair number of years in and out of the classroom in various ways, you know, being a teacher, a math teacher in high school and middle school, in public schools. And I think ultimately what brought me to my final destination, as it were, as somebody who identifies as a psychological scientist, is that I finally got to do something where I got the energy of being an analytic thinker, like a McKinsey consultant, a scientist, like I had been trained to do in my major of neurobiology and neuroscience. And then also I got back to kids, because what I usually study is the development of grit and other capabilities. And so I always say to the, you know, younger adults that are in my office hours, even if those office hours are on Zoom now, is that it is a bit of a wandering path. I think no matter how we would like the path to be straight as an arrow, it is for most people, you know, very serpentine.
Maybe that's something to, you know, acknowledge and lean into as well. I think so many of us are taught that it should be a completely linear path, and if you're straying from that linear path, you're wasting time or getting distracted or you know, whittling your life away. And it's certainly not the case. You need to embrace the fact it's going to be a bit of a sampling exercise, and I love that frame. So, Angela, you've certainly studied the mind a lot. You've studied neurobiology at Harvard, neuroscience at Oxford, and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. When you study the mind and what you find to be, tell me what you find to be most surprising about how the human mind works. What are some of the things you've learned that are especially surprising, especially as it relates to how the way we think shapes our behavior?
You know, when I was in my undergraduate years, you know, learning about the brain for the first time, this is now, you know, talking about the late 80s, right? What the received wisdom was from science at that point was that the brain was pretty much what it was going to be, right? By the time, you know, you reached certainly our age, but, you know, even maybe your, you know, your 20s, that there was some amount of plasticity, but not really meaningful change. I think one thing that has shifted in the decades since I went to my, you know, first neurobiology class in the 80s is that we understand that the brain is a miracle. I mean, it is plastic in meaningful ways all throughout the lifespan. And when you think of the brain as something which continues to develop and improve and grow throughout much of the lifespan, it makes you a little more optimistic about what you can change about yourself. And in parallel to all this brain research on plasticity, there's been advances in psychological science where we now realize that, for example, personalities change in meaningful ways. And by the way, usually for the better. So psychologists sometimes call this the maturity principle, that in most ways, most people, with some exceptions, get better. They become more agreeable, more understanding of other people's situations, more dependable, more responsible, better executive function. So I think the story of the brain as we now understand it is that it is a miraculous organ. It sets us apart from all other species, and its signature quality is plasticity and the capacity for learning, which we never lose. It's not something that is restricted to childhood.
And that is counter, I think, to what so many of us learned earlier in our teaching and so on, is that there is a certain amount of inertia that kicks in after you're, past your teens, and that your brain almost starts decaying at that point. And what you're saying is that the newer research is really reflecting the fact that this is something that builds over time, and it's a muscle that you can continue developing as long as you're alive.
Muscle is exactly the metaphor that many of my colleagues like, because, muscles kind of obviously get stronger or weaker with use or disuse, right? I mean, nobody would think like, oh, I went to the gym 10 times in 1989. Like, why aren't I strong now? It's like people are like, oh, wait, hold on. No, you have to keep going to the gym. And by the way, if you really, do your exercises methodically, like, yes, you can get, stronger, more flexible, et cetera. So it's a great metaphor. I will also say, when you think about muscles, you're like, wait, I also remember that when I was 16, I was pretty much physically invincible. So let me just say this about the brain. It's not that we are exactly the same level of plasticity and suppleness in terms of our brain and as a 3-year-old. No, the 3-year-olds are better at learning than the 53-year-olds, right? But the point is that the 53-year-olds still can learn. So plasticity never goes to zero and remains at a level where it's meaningful. But it's also true, when you thought, when you said decline after, say your teen years, well, it is also true. So I have to footnote this, that, in terms of, for example, processing speed, and I have teenagers at home, so it's kind of so clear to me, processing speed, just like clock speed, it does kind of peak around 17. So if you ever have the impression that this young whippersnapper that you just hired seems smarter than you, well, all things being equal, statistically, they probably are a little. You just know more, and you're probably wiser.
Right.
And I think that's maybe the way to think about, development. That we never fully lose our capacity to learn. It's always a substantial capacity, and you are accumulating wisdom, strategies, self-awareness. And I think those are the things that, the younger generation is always going to be catching up to the older generation on.
Right. Great. Let's shift gears a little bit, Angela, and talk about grit for a moment. So you've touched on the term grit a couple of times in our conversation so far. This is the concept you talk about in your book, obviously, in your TED Talk, and you define grit as passion and perseverance for very long-term goals, and being able to run the marathon rather than just the sprint, essentially. Can you expound on this definition for our audience and talk more completely about what you mean by grit?
When I was just starting out in graduate school, which, remember, picture me at age 32, I at that point, being a little bit older than most of the students, and in fact, I think I was even older than some of my professors, I did know what I wanted to study, though. I really wanted to reverse engineer human achievement. I wanted to ask the question, can we demystify even the highest level of human achievement? Is it really just that they're geniuses? Is there nothing that we could maybe emulate or imitate? So that led me to interview high achievers across different fields, including law and, also the arts, music, sports, science, medicine. And, the more of these interviews I did with outstanding performers, the more I got interested in what the through line was. What does a world-class ballerina have in common with a Nobel Prize economist? And I think the through line ended up being, I'm a fan of alliteration, so passion and perseverance for long-term goals. It's really about stamina in the direction of effort. That's perseverance, right? Do you keep going even after setbacks? Do you go on for years and work really hard? But the commitment part is the passion. if you work really hard, as I'm sure most people that maybe in your circles do, but you're working at like one thing, and then 2 years later you're working on a different thing, and then a year later you've shifted again. I think that you don't make substantial progress, like, because you keep changing direction. So perseverance is the intuitive part of grit. But what I mean by passion for long-term goals is that you are staying in love with something, and in some abstract way, at least, going in the same direction for a long time. And when you think about people who have accomplished great things on this planet, I think it's just a necessity that you have to have some North Star, or you end up, basically running really hard in all different directions.
So can you talk a little bit about, you managed to pull apart something that really highlighted this grit and this long-term view as being something that drives that profound long-term success, and that it's something above and beyond just raw capability. If you think about, IQ or other measures of raw intelligence, which is maybe a bit of a surprising and counterintuitive finding. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
It's personal for me, really, because, my father, who's no longer alive, but when we were like little kids, my dad just, not every day, but he really liked to think about who was more able and who was more gifted. And, I think in his own family, he had this like rank ordering among the kids of like, who's the smartest in his head, right? Of who was, he rated himself pretty close to the top there, by the way. I don't think he thought of me as being especially brilliant. I mean, he used to say like, you're no genius. And I just out of the blue. And I think that may have given me a little chip on my shoulder to try to understand, what other than innate ability, innate giftedness, like, could there be that would determine how much of an impact you would have as a person. And what I find in my research, and what has now been found by lots of scientists who study grit, is that it's not positively correlated with intelligence. It doesn't go hand in hand. It's not that smarter people based on IQ scores are grittier. And in fact, in the largest sample that I've collected, that's at the US Military Academy at West Point. It is the largest, it's the oldest military institution in the United States. We find that grit, which has been collected, I think, almost every year for more than a decade, is usually negatively related to standardized intelligence scores or cognitive ability scores. So I think this distinction between, what comes easily to you and how long and hard you're willing to work for it are distinct. It doesn't mean, by the way, that ability doesn't matter. It just means that it's not enough. And I find it so fascinating that, the more able people don't necessarily get up earlier, stay up later, and stick with things for more years.
By the way, I hope you were able to buff that chip out of your shoulder when you won the MacArthur Prize, which is sometimes called the Genius Prize. So
yeah, there was a small satisfaction there, and my dad loved prizes, so it was a good day when I got to tell him about that.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about the relationship between grit and burnout. And I think it's something, our listeners who are legal professionals would be especially interested in hearing about how you think about this ability to persevere and the focus on long-term goals as potentially being a way of avoiding burnout, and tell us a little bit more about that relationship, and maybe to start out, define how you think about burnout as well, because that's something that is often framed in different ways.
Burnout, when scientists talk about burnout, it's the psychological state of exhaustion that has a few hallmarks. So one of the hallmarks of this state of exhaustion is just the feeling. I mean, that's the term burnout, like feeling like you're really at the end, like that you are tired, that you can't go on, at least the way that you have been going on in the past. Another hallmark is a sense of helplessness, right? The sense that like you're putting in effort, but there's not a lot coming out on the other end, that things are beyond your control, and you're no longer having the impact that you maybe wanted to have or used to have. And then also there's an interesting sense of what's sometimes called depersonalization, and other people would call it like skepticism. But what it really is, it's like a lack of feeling connected to your client or to the world. Like there's a kind of like remove that is not a good remove. It's like feeling like a lack of personal connection. So this state, by the way, is as higher in some professions than others. And I think it's interesting that the professions that burnout is a particular problem end up being the service professions. So medicine, teaching, and of course the law. And these are all professions where like you are serving another person, like you are helping. I think the irony, or maybe not the irony, is just the fact that you are so caring about what you do, and because other people depend on you, I think actually sets you up for burnout, right? If you just didn't care, you would not get burned out. You're like, oh, whatever, like,
Right.
who cares? Like, so I think the vulnerability to burnout actually in some ways is a testament to the compassion and the sense of purpose that people would bring to a profession like the law. My best friend in the world is named Sue, and she's a law partner. And so I got to have a kind of a first, well, it's not a first person, but I kind of a front row seat anyway to the journey of somebody in a legal career. And it really is, it's so hard. And I think the fact that the clients are needing things when they need them, how they need them, on their own schedule, amplifies a lot of the pressures that any of us would be in. So the question of like, well, how does grit relate to burnout? Well, empirically, there have been a number of studies looking at burnout questionnaire data and then grit scale scores. So the scale that I developed to measure passion and perseverance. And generally, they're inversely correlated, meaning that if you are higher in measured grit, you would be potentially less likely to feel burned out. But most of these studies are cross-sectional. So all on one day, I measure both. And I wonder myself whether the grittiest people, the people who are just incredibly passionate and persevering, if you follow them over time, might at some point be the ones who would be vulnerable because they care so much. And the advice I would have on this, Jack, which is, I think the most important thing to say was like, okay, great. That's what science says about what it is. And like, wow, but like, what do I do? So this advice I'm going to borrow from a sports psychologist actually named Michael Gervais. He's the sports psychologist to the Seattle Seahawks football team. And I asked him about burnout, especially because, for athletes, there's the version of burnout, which is basically overtraining, where athletes also like you might feel one day, like, you wake up and you're just flattened. You're just so exhausted. You feel like you. So he says to his athletes, the answer is actually kind of the most logical thing, which is you actually have to do less. You have to the prescription is like sleep. The prescription is, take some time off. The prescription is a vacation. The prescription is reducing hours. And I know that some of the grittiest people really don't like that prescription because their whole identity is like staying on the treadmill longer than anyone else. But I think it's a really, you said marathon, not sprint. If you really think of your career and your ability to help other people as something that you can't sprint through, that you would hope to do it for years, if not a lifetime, then you have to take the recommendation of this, great sports psychologist and actually kind of take your foot off the gas a little bit.
That's great advice. And I'd love to explore more of the ways some of your ideas apply to the legal profession. And you point out that in some cases you see an inverse correlation between, raw talent and grit. And when you have a lot of raw talent, law is one of those professions that your parents, and it sounds like you had some of the same kind of pressure, law, medicine, you're being ushered in those directions. But then when you get in the profession, you get on the front lines, and you're going to need to be gritty if you're going to survive the pressures of the environment around you. in
Can I ask
your
you just like because I told you I had a front row seat, but I wasn't on the stage because like I didn't become a lawyer. I hear stories from my good friend, who's by the way a very fulfilled lawyer. So she's not exiting the profession; she's staying in it. But like, what are the pressures? Like, the law school is one thing, but like, what would a young lawyer encounter in terms of these challenges that they didn't experience before?
I think the challenges are often going to be navigating so much that law school didn't prepare them for. If we look at, law school does a great job of training you in the art of law, but when you graduate from law school, and many new graduates are in a position where they're hanging their own shingle and starting their own law firm, needing to run a business, find clients, deal with, as you mentioned, I think the emotionally charged nature of so many of their interactions with clients, and maybe this image they had of what pursuing law would look like in law school doesn't end up mapping very cleanly to what their day-to-day reality looks like. And the challenges, I think that can be especially deep challenges are around how to run a business effectively, how to run a law firm effectively. So those are some of the things I see on the front lines in terms of what the young lawyer that maybe fell in love with the idea of what the noble pursuit of law and order and justice would look like, finding a way to actually realize that in their day-to-day, or conversely, joining a big law firm and having an unbelievable set of pressures put on them, where in some cases they're treated very much like fungible commodities by the partnership that will burn out and move out within the next year or two. And that burnout you're describing is almost an expected outcome, not something to be avoided. So I think
that's really helpful, like texture. And I think could be analogously, like somebody really likes to cook and then they start a restaurant. It's like cooking and restaurants have some overlap, but guess what, running a restaurant has lots of other features that don't have anything to do, honestly, with like
that's
making
a
really
great analogy. I think it's very much
omelet.
some of the same challenges.
So here's a thought about why it might be that that intelligence and ability, having a great LSAT score, like and just being somebody who's excelled and for whom learning has in some ways come easy. Like why that's not an entirely protective factor when you encounter these new challenges. If you grow up and you are the kid who's like the smartest one in the class and everything's coming fast to you, you just don't have a lot of experience in falling down, stumbling, feeling awkward and clumsy and like making a bunch of mistakes. And I wonder whether that lack of experience, that lack of practice, and the fact that you've been able to skate by on these other strengths, it is a bit of a vulnerability, when it comes to, because I think no matter who you are, and I think you'll agree with me, Jack, you've certainly interviewed a lot of people, like no matter who you are, you're gonna get just smacked in the face by life,
Yeah.
And it's just like, wow. So I think that if it happens to you for the first time and you're like 28, like that's just hard. Whereas somebody who's really struggled in lots of ways along the way might have a certain robustness and a certain skill set. So that doesn't mean, by the way, that the 28-year-old can't learn those things, but I do think it gives you some idea of like how we might need to support some of the brightest, in fact, young lawyers in their journey.
Have you refined some of your thinking on how to develop grit? You answer the question sometimes saying, I don't really know what the formula is. I know when I see it and it's a trait that you can identify. But if you're, a parent that is trying to teach their kids grittiness, if you're somebody that is in a profession or you're just in life and you're trying to figure out how do I get more gritty, what's that look like? Do you have some advice on how to develop that front?
So I'm teaching a class now that I created called Grit Lab, and it is the science and practice of passion and perseverance. So my students are undergraduates at my University of Pennsylvania. And let me just give you some of the kind of key design features that I think, you could take a kind of a page from that and think like, okay, this is how I apply it. So one is like, I really believe that we all grow faster when we have some understanding of like what it is that we're actually trying to develop. So imagine setting goals and making plans, right? We all set goals, we all make plans, but there is actually like a 40-year research literature on the best way to set goals and make plans and what happens in the brain and in the mind when you set goals and make plans. I think that if you learn that material, if you have like the user manual for your own mind and brain, like you'll be better at then like acquiring that skill set. So I have a lecture on setting goals and making plans, and the students learn all about it, and then they actually practice it and they get feedback from their own life experience, but also from their teams. They're all in teams, and then their TAs. I think the meta lesson for me is that if you want to have children who grow up to be gritty or to be grateful, to be kind, to be curious, I think if they understood, how those things worked, like, why does the brain have the state of curiosity, and what is it when you're bored? Like, what happens to attention when you're bored, and why does learning fall off like a cliff? Like, that will help them the next time they're bored, like at least understand what's going on, and then identify ways to be less bored, et cetera. So the kind of secret sauce, I think, of Grit Lab is like that understanding and self-awareness will catalyze maturation. And I think as a parent, I was actually pregnant with my second daughter when I was in my first year of graduate school. So I basically became a psychologist and a mom all at the same time. And I remember thinking like, I wonder how old your kids have to be before you can talk to them about motivation and talk to them about goals, talk to them about, challenge and failure. And I will tell you this, it's really young. Like, kids are, like we said, so smart. And as long as you don't use a lot of jargon, if you read children's books, you will be amazed how much psychological like richness there. Go read Frog and Toad and you're like, oh wow. So kids can at a very young age understand these things, and I think it's not too early to bring them along on this educational journey that I do think will help catalyze their development.
That's great. Well, Angela, I've really enjoyed our conversation. We're going to be digging more into the concept of grit and how it relates to the legal profession in our conversation at the Clio Cloud Conference on October 13th. So I'm so looking forward to chatting to you again then. Thanks again for joining us on the podcast. It was a huge pleasure to chat with you and to hear from you. And I'm looking forward to picking up our conversation soon.
Thank you, Jack. I'm really looking forward to the conference as well.
Thanks for joining us on Daily Matters, a podcast from Clio. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Daily Matters is produced by Andrew Booth, Sam Rosenthal, and Derek Boland, and hosted by yours truly, Jack Newton. Thanks also to Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal technology provider, for supporting this podcast.